Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fiscal Focus at DawnNews English. I'm your host, Danish Khan, and today I'm joined by Aasim Sajjad Akhtar. Aasim is one of the most eminent scholars of Pakistan. And what makes Aasim unique is he's not just a scholar, but he's also a practitioner who engages with grassroots movements across Pakistan. Thank you, Aasim, for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. I want to start with the recent economic indicators, which show that at the macroeconomic scale, uh, variables are improving. But do you think those variables or these improvements in these macroeconomic variables have been felt by the working and middle classes in Pakistan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the context is important. They've been improving, but that simply means they've, like, for instance, inflation may have come down from something astronomical like 30% to the low double digits, or,
Mm.
maybe the high single digits. That's still, like, as you say, that still affects people on a salaried paycheck, or even more than that. The vast majority of working people in this country don't even have a paycheck. They go day to day. So there's simply no question that no matter whatever relative improvements there may have been, that doesn't, so to speak, trickle down. That's sort of the story of Pakistan and most of the world at the moment, because the kind of capitalism that we are in has very little, very few fruits for those in the lower rungs of the ladder.
Yes, I mean, actually, we can divide this economic crisis. One is that macroeconomic crisis that Pakistan has been facing, and the other is the livelihood crisis, where, average folks, especially working and middle classes, have been struggling a lot. You have been very active with a grassroots and civil society movement called Kachi Abadi Alliance, and you have published work on housing issues of Pakistan as well. How they have been impacted, especially these informal housing settlements in the past few years.
I mean, it's not just the past few years. Over most of the last at least 25 or so years since I've been, involved with these movements, the first thing that they face regularly is insecurity of tenure, which is really a nice way of saying that they are faced with class war all the time. Their settlements are bulldozed, and it's not just their homes. It's also, as you noted, there most of them are daily wage workers, so they may be street vendors, they may be construction workers, and all of that is also subject to perpetual attacks by whether it be the local administrative apparatus, whether it be in some cases when you have, especially in our big cities, the expansion of housing schemes. You see a lot of these mass demolitions. So, I mean, this is a perpetual matter, and it's only just become more acute in recent years, right? With these, as you say, these massive inflationary bubbles. And really, I don't see that changing very much, because on the whole, the larger scheme of things, our urban planners don't really sort of factor in these huge in migrants. Basically, these are migrant workers over decades
Mm.
that come and set up these shanties. And there's no planning for them. The only planning that exists here is for, as I said, for these big housing estates and their land grabs.
Actually, I mean, the development processes in Pakistan have become synonymous with the growth of these housing or gated housing enclaves or societies. And there hasn't been much planning in terms of housing low-income households. So, how do you see this conflict where many working people are left to just rely on market forces and they've been priced out of these gated housing enclaves? And also, what are some socioeconomic and environmental aspects of these gated housing enclaves?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that there's been little planning, there's basically no planning. On the one hand, these housing estates and real estateization, if you want to call it that, swallows up all of this peri-urban land, right, which was once used for agriculture. So there's all of that. Then they dig deep, bore hundreds of feet into the ground. The water table decreases. Then even other sorts of impacts, intangible impacts that some of these constructions are done in ways that, for instance, 2.5 years ago, when there was these massive floods in this country, post facto it became clear that a lot of this was because of the way in which these schemes were constructed. They blocked natural drainage systems. I mean, that's one side of the story. And then the other side of the story, as we've already noted, is just the fact that these schemes cater to the rich. And in fact, sometimes they're not even occupied. So you have these absentee, in a sense, modern urban landlords who buy up these schemes, sell these plots, and use value is really not at all, a matter of concern for either the planners, for the developers, for the investors. A lot of these investors, by the way, are diaspora Pakistanis, right? So they send money back home. These plots, they have a lot of these are asset bubbles. They're volatile, but it is an opportunity to make a lot of money. And none of this, none of what I've just described, contains any sort of plan or any sort of story in which the vast majority of people who need housing in our cities, which are low income migrant workers over decades, they don't factor. And as you say, they're left to their own devices. And for the record, kachi abadis or informal settlements, people tend to think of them as free riders, but
Mhm.
they're not. As you say, this is an underground market for housing, which when you're priced out of the formal housing market, then there's an informal housing market, which also, by the way, involves state functionaries. It also involves under the table payments, but it's a fully developed market. And that's the only recourse that working people have, because the predominant model of housing and development simply excludes them entirely.
I think you made a brilliant point. So it's not lack of or inadequate development of markets. Market is there. It's just that, markets do not always allocate resources efficiently or in an optimal way. And Kachi Abadis, or what you call these shanty towns, are a classical example of this. In Pakistan, there's a lot of discussion about IMF all the time. And I think in September, IMF released I they at least agreed to release a new tranche. So, what are some shortcomings of just thinking about IMF programs as a way out of this economic crisis? And is there an alternative to IMF policies or program?
Well, it's not just some shortcomings, it's a fundamental long-term structural crisis where, as you know, and many of your listeners will know, this is about the 25th time we've gone to the IMF. So this is not just something that we've started doing or thinking about now. It's been going on for the best part of 35 years. And it's born out of a fundamental imbalance in the way the state and the ruling class thinks about both the nature of the state and the way in which resources are allocated. So fundamentally, state that allocates a huge proportion of its resources to its national security apparatus, and then to make up, in a sense, the deficit for all of that unproductive spending, we borrow. And that's quite aside from the fact that I said that even our capitalists here don't really care about putting money into a factory and creating jobs, right? They would rather just do land grabs and speculate on real estate. So you have like this ruling class, which is unconcerned with in a sense, well, not even unconcerned, is simply never going to in a sense bite the hand that feeds itself. And then the only way out then is to go to the IMF. And then there's a whole set of other questions about the kinds of policy prescriptions that the IMF actually offers and how that then exacerbates this jobless sort of growth story over a long period of time, creates incentives for investors, and the purpose is ultimately to make sure that the creditors are paid back. And so the debt just spirals. And of course, this is not just a Pakistani story. This is a story of much of the erstwhile third world, about Latin America, about much of sub-Saharan Africa. There are only a handful of examples of countries that have broken out of this trap. And Pakistan is certainly not one of those, because its structural crisis is perhaps even more debilitating, because of the way in which our militarized ruling class thinks about what this state is supposed to do.
So it seems like what you're referring to, this is directly tied to the political economy of the country, and especially the way the power is distributed across society. Now, in your recent book titled Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan, Fear, Desires, and Revolutionary Horizons, you talk about young people and especially their aspirations in Pakistan in this new age of, digital technologies. So first tell us, like, especially you also teach young people, what are their aspirations? Because we also see a lot of people moving overseas. And do you think the existing system has an ability to serve millions of new young people or new entrants into the labor market, especially the young people?
Well, no, absolutely not. It doesn't. We're in the midst of a demographic sort of explosion, the kinds of which this country has never seen before. I think now a lot of people have come to realize that the majority of our population is extremely young. The median age is something like 23. And for better or for worse, all of these, or a large majority of these young people, are brought up within a very, in a sense, individuated, cutthroat capitalist world, right? Where you compete for limited jobs. I mean, in this country, the coveted jobs were always the government public sector jobs. But given the fact that at a minimum, something like 2 to 3 million people come into the job market every year, and that's just the formal labor force, right? We have an entire informal labor force for which we often don't even have adequate statistics. So there's no government jobs. There's no private industry that is now creating jobs. Agriculture is increasingly mechanized, and you have concentration of land, which means that more and more people are being displaced from agriculture. And what you noted about a lot of people going abroad, well, there's some people who go abroad, high skilled labor categories, maybe, with the kind of, in a sense, social or cultural capital to be able to get a job abroad, go abroad through a visa system. But the vast majority of people and young people in this country who go abroad do so literally through human smuggling routes. They're trying by hook or by crook to get to Southern Europe, where they set up, where they become street vendors, for instance. And so this is a massive social crisis in the making. And as I've already noted, those with power in this country really don't seem to care. I mean, we have gimmicks every once in a while. We talk about youth or digital Pakistan or, what have you. But beyond the slogans, there's no fundamental, recognition or attempt, let alone attempt, to restructure the way our political economy works so that you change your focus towards people's welfare, towards employment generation, towards addressing rural urban mass migrations or even out migrations, towards productive investments rather than real estateization or speculative profiteering or land grabs or resource grabs. I mean, none of that is happening, and it has to be named before it could happen. And then maybe young people's aspirations could be met in ways that are both sort of they themselves stop thinking about this as a zero-sum game where they're competing with one another and it's a cutthroat competition. And then you have maybe some forms of collective politics that also then, open up space for future generations, because of course Pakistan also faces severe environmental degradation as well. So there's all sorts of interrelated crises which people are neither naming, let alone doing anything about.
Makes sense. And it seems like the debate and battle of ideas in Pakistan cannot seem to go beyond the current political affairs, right? And there's no serious discussion on economic issues. And you have written about them both in like popular media, like your op-eds for Dawn, and also in academic papers about reimagining economic systems. So especially to young people, what would you say, like what are some contours of reimagining economic system in Pakistan?
Well, first of all, I think that, and it's not a very complicated idea. It's just that the age in which we live, it feels like this is an anachronism. First of all, we need a redistributive, program. This is a highly unequal country, whether we're talking about land, whether we're talking about asset ownership in general, all sorts of indicators, whether we're even talking about our taxation regime, and redistribution, which across the world up to 30 or 40 years ago seemed like a no-brainer, is now just not on the agenda. Right now, whether that means land reforms of the classical kind, as I said, urban land reform, I think is something, or various kinds of land taxes can be levied, even income tax, right? So as you know, we have an extremely low sort of tax net when it comes to just income tax, especially for the rich and powerful. So, I mean, this is one sort of fundamental facet of a transformative political and economic program where we need to redistribute wealth. And that is a bit of a zero-sum game, right? That means you take from the rich to give to those who are not rich. It's not rocket science, but it seems to have gone out of fashion. Beyond that, then we need productive investments, right? We need a, sort of an economic model where you're not throwing your money, whether it be government or whether it be private money, into speculative sort of sectors, like real estate is a classic example. Or even if you have like the kinds of things that is happening dime a dozen now, or mineral exploration in places like Balochistan or the ex-tribal districts. I mean, that's very extractive, right? It's happening in ways with multinationals and the state that doesn't serve the needs of the people there. And that, of course, is giving rise to all sorts of conflict. These are old conflicts, but they're sharpening. So then we're talking about productive investments with an emphasis on generating gainful employment, ensuring that people feel like their resources are being natural resources in particular are being used for their benefit and over the long run to meet their welfare needs, whether it be education, health, and various kinds of an infrastructure. We have an infrastructure binge in this country, which is road building. And that road building also tends to serve a very sort of elite segment, with cars. It's suburban to as you say, to in some ways service some of these real estate, it's housing schemes. So I mean, I think there are ways in which some of this very straightforward logic of an alternative economic system can be posited. And I don't think it's very difficult to do, but as you say, that requires us to go beyond the everyday sensationalism of who's in the seat and how am I going to get him out based on some, sensational slogan of my own. And that's really what I think our establishment has reduced our political sort of mainstream to.
I mean, in your, I think, 2018 book titled The Politics of Common Sense, you talk about this patronage politics in contrast to transformative politics. Uh, Now, it seems like even the so-called the Party for Change, for example, the PTI, which is, I think, still popular among young people in Pakistan, but when they got into power, they still engaged in the similar type of patronage politics. Uh, but still young people are fascinated by it. So from a transformative political transformation project, right? How can we go beyond this mainstream politics, which just circulates around who sits in the prime minister office and nothing concrete in terms of economic policies?
Well, I mean, that's of course the fundamental question. How do you take, this population of young people who have, as you've noted, and I think it's important for us to recognize, via the particular political vehicle that is the PTI, and then of course the leadership of the PTI and Imran Khan in particular, has captured the attention of a lot of young people who otherwise really, looked at politics as something they wanted to have nothing to do with. But the limitations of that project have also been clear, both when in power and even after they've been kicked out of government. What I will say is that I think it's important to recognize that those young people are interested, even if their understanding or their ability to see beyond the particular, the immediate conjuncture, may be limited, not because they would want to, but because there's larger structural forces with the way in which politics is designed and propagated. But I do think that there's space to talk about the types of things that we are talking about, right? And I think that space, the more we cultivate that space, the more we say, well, it's not just about who's in power right now, or it's not just about XYZ, person or XYZ leader of XYZ institution. It's about larger structural forces, class forces, institutional logics of the state, the way in which, as we've noted, the state is perpetually patronized by foreign powers, whether it be the IMF or with the bilateral donors. I think that space has to be cultivated. I don't think there's a shortcut. I don't think that we can say, well, if we have wave this magic wand, all of these young people will suddenly flock to some kind of progressive alternative. I think it is a space that we have to cultivate, that we have to keep, banging our head against the wall and say, look, it's not sufficient just to be against the incumbent. What a sufficient condition to actually change things is for us to think about the deeper underlying causes, which have a long history. And it's not just since Imran Khan was in power or out of power that all of these things have started happening. And I think that is something that is important to appeal to. You talked about common sense, and to appeal to what Gramsci, who I borrowed that term from, would say, good sense. And I think that good sense is potentially there amongst large segments of our young population. And it's about the extent to which we could penetrate these echo chambers and make these conversations mainstream.
Now, as a critical reflection, and I also include myself in this when I pose this question, uh, many social scientists, especially critical social scientists in Pakistan, have been focusing on this civil military binary as one of the defining aspects of Pakistan political economy. And it makes sense starting with the works of Hamza Alavi and others, and you have contributed to this debate in significant ways. But then the history shows us these civilian actors, whenever they get chance, they just repeat the same things and they don't offer any significant alternative to the overall the state apparatus the way it's designed. So is it time for us to even move beyond that civil military binary and frame these elites in a new way?
Well, I don't think we need to move beyond it, but I think we can include or expand, this debate and to say, well, to reduce it to the fact that, for instance, that for a long time there was this sort of general understanding amongst pro-democratic, and that's a wide cross-section of people in this country, pro-democratic forces, that if you have repeated elections and if you have a repeated sort of, you don't have a military coup in there, and that will improve things. And I think it is now apparent that that's not been borne out by, especially, let's say, the last now 17 years, right? 16, 17 years since the last time we had a formal dictatorship. And I think so, therefore, the fact that there is a civil military sort of contradiction in this country, I think that there's just no way around it. That's a fact. But it's not sufficient, I think, is what the way to think about, to say, well, that's all we have to talk about. We
Mm.
do have to talk about that, but we do have to talk about class. So, for instance, if there's the civil, and the civil that we're talking about in this story is just not interested in redressing class privilege, partly because its own ruling, it's part of the ruling class in a sense, even if it's a junior member,
Mm.
then it's not sufficient to say, well, the civil should be supreme, right? Then we have to say, well, there has to be something other beyond that as well. Or in our country, we have a serious question of nationhood and nationalities, and the way in which we have peripheries that are perpetually on the receiving end of whether it be repression or, as I said, extractive economic logics. These are things that we have to insert into the debate to make it more meaningful. Otherwise, as you say, what ends up happening is that we have repeated disappointments, right? Where people say, well, a regime's going to come in and it's made all of these promises, but then we're sort of waiting to be disappointed because it is the usual suspects, after all, who've been in the saddle, even if, as I say, a junior partner to the mill of the civ mill sort of binary. So I think that is what we need to do. I don't think it's either or, that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. But we sort of, as I said, with everything else, we have to sort of deepen the terms of the debate, and we have to sort of come up with a better, more long-term sort of prognosis about the kind of politics and the kinds of transformative politics that we need to really change the lives of I think, the working mass of people, which is what people like myself are interested in. I frankly couldn't be too bothered with what we started with the macroeconomic figures, because, as we noted, that doesn't really tell us the story of how people's lives are being lived.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense. You put it in a really good terms here. Now, building on this theme as a critical reflection of progressive scholars and activists, uh, I feel the project of a progressive, inclusive Pakistan hasn't been formulated or at least portrayed in the public in a way that incorporates the aspirations of peripheries within this broader project of inclusive Pakistan. So, in your vision, what would that inclusive, progressive Pakistan would entail?
I think fundamentally we have to revisit this historical conception that this is a country which is comprised of sort of one notional nation. And I think in practice, and you know, we have a lot of history, a lot of, in a sense, bitter histories behind us to prove this. It's more useful to think about this as a multinational country, right? Where there are different ethnic national groups, linguistic groups. They have their own histories, they have their own long histories, long preceding the 1947 creation of this country. And until all of that is recognized and you have some kind of notion of a voluntary social contract where all of these ethnic nations choose to build a project together, I mean, you can sort of project all you want that, you know, it's sort of like one nation, one language, one religion, which is what we've done from the beginning. But the truth is that it hasn't really worked, right? It's if you try and generate consent around that, even that hasn't, let alone the coercive methods that have been at work for all of these years. So I think that if you want to have a project that can work for, as you say, for the peripheries, it requires recognition of their identities. And as I said earlier, it also requires recognition and acknowledgement and a structural formula to ensure that they don't have reason to believe, and I think there's good reason for them to believe, that their resources tend to be extracted away from from what should be their own welfare to the welfare of mainstream or metropolitan Pakistan, or even beyond, right? Because as I said, this political economy is we are tied into a global political economy, and that also has a history. And I think that's possible to do, but as we've noted already, that requires an acknowledgement before you create the conditions for that voluntary social contract to take new shape.
Yeah, I mean, you put it in good terms that it's a multi-ethnic country, which is a strength, which should be celebrated rather than seeing this as a limitation of this project. Now, in terms of how to incorporate aspirations of periphery, is so the redistribution not only in terms of class lines, but also in terms of this regional disparities also needed. How would you see that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's correct. I mean, to some extent, a lot of people, especially parliamentary forces, point to the fact, well, we did that already in 2010. We passed something called the 18th Amendment, and we created what we call a National Finance Award, which was, you know, a more regionally equitable award than had ever been the case. That's true, but there's also sort of an elephant in the room, which is that a lot of our, as I say, a lot of our economic affairs are not actually adequately captured by formal statistics. So, for instance, a lot of our peripheries, whether it's the Baloch periphery or the Pashtun periphery, are borders. And the amount of stuff that comes across our borders, which we tend to just dismiss as smuggled goods, but really we're talking about, you know, a lot of valuable trade. And that trade tends to be in the black. It is not neither accounted for, let alone is it sort of, as I said, is the benefits of that trade accruing to those regions themselves. So there's a lot of redistributive stories that are not adequately captured by the 18th Amendment that represented a step. But you know, we do have a de facto Pakistan and a de jure Pakistan, as you know. And I think the de jure story is just not sufficient to meet, as you say, these regional redistributive needs, let alone the fact that there's an entire sort of set of natural resources like a Rekodip, like Sandak, like, you know, extremely rich forested, dense forested regions in the mountainous highlands that are subject to extraction and extractive logics. And I think that is an ongoing story, let alone the stories that have preceded that. So all of this, again, first acknowledgement and then redressal. That's the only way to build a viable project that in which people feel like, okay, we are equal partners.
Makes sense. And thank you so much, Asim, for your time. It was wonderful talking with you. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus at Dawn News English.